Social Justice Podcast.
You're listening to a social justice podcast hosted by NICOLA SPURLING, brought to you by The Flag Shop, and inspired by a social justice coloring book. Hello, this is a social justice podcast. I'm your host, NICOLA SPURLING, and today I'm joined by Rowan Jetté Knox for a conversation about trans rights in Canada. Rowan, thanks for joining. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely, Nicola. I am Rowan. My pronouns are he and him. I'm a trans man based out of Toronto. I am an author, speaker, and human rights advocate. I specialize in LGBTQ and mental health, and very specifically trans rights, and very, very specifically, I do a lot of work on protecting trans kids.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, so am I.
And this is our first virtual episode, so just a note for our audience, please bear with us if we run into any challenges. First of all, I want to get into a little bit about you and what does being trans mean to you?
Well, just right off the bat, huh?
Right off the bat, just get straight into that. And feel free to sort of introduce yourself a little bit further as you're answering that question if you like to.
Sure. So I had quite an introduction to trans people and the trans community. About 10 years ago, our middle child, at the time, we had 3 children. My partner and I now have 4. But at the time, we had 3, and our 11-year-old came out to us as trans. So that was in 2014 when there wasn't a lot of info out there about trans kids. We chose to affirm and support in the best ways we could. And about a year and a half after that, my partner, who I'd known for a long time, over 20 years, we've been together for 22 years, we had been married for 17, came out to me as a trans woman. So now I had a child and a partner who were both trans. And our family really sort of became an example of what it looks like to be a positive, affirming family. Little did I know at the time that my egg, if you will, was going to crack many years later, and I was going to figure out that I was in fact trans. So being trans to me, really what it boils down to, having watched so many people in my life transitioning myself, it means authenticity. It means being able to be free. It means being able to be the best version of myself, which is really what everybody wants to do, right? We all want to be that best version of ourselves. So I get to be the best version of me with the support of my community and my medical team and everything else, and live a life that feels so much better than it ever has.
Wonderful. And you've really reached so many people. I mean, I was just mentioning to one of the people that I play soccer with yesterday that I was going to be doing this interview with you. And they said, wow, Rowan's wife was my motivation for transitioning. And I went, that's so amazing that you've reached that many people that I can just mention it casually to someone and they have a connection to you almost immediately.
Yeah, that means a lot. I'm going to let her know after this episode. It's funny because Zoe, my wife, she's a very private person in so many ways, but we became a public face with our child. That is what our child really wanted as well, because when they went looking for positive examples in 2014, there were so few of them, of families that learn and embrace their child. So they really wanted us to be one of those beacons of light, if you will, for the next person who went searching for answers. And because we were already so public at that point, then it was an undeniable fact that she was going to have to transition publicly as well. So, but her telling that story and then me telling our story as a family in my first book, that has helped, from what I hear from people, and I still hear from so many people today, has helped so many people be able to figure themselves out. They just need to see examples out there. Thankfully, we're not the only one. There are many now, but also they've been able to give that book or that knowledge, that story to somebody else, a family member, a friend, a partner, and say, here's a blueprint on how to love someone through transition. So I have no regrets that we did that.
And I don't think we've really gotten into why it was that you were so public. So can you explain sort of what brought you into the public light?
I had a blog. It was not a big blog. I had a blog. It was mostly read locally. There were some people in other parts of Canada and around the world who did read it, but largely we were living in Ottawa, and my audience was largely Ottawans. And it was it was like a mommy blog, if you will, at the time. It was sort of a tongue-in-cheek, life isn't perfect, here's the chaos. I wanted to sort of get away from the idea of everything being perfect in a family, which is what a lot of bloggers were doing at the time. And I just thought that was really disingenuous. It's tough being a parent. It's tough raising kids. So I wanted to really demonstrate that, but in a fun and positive way. When our child came out, the last thing I wanted to do was be public, not because I was embarrassed or ashamed in any way. It was because I wanted to protect my child. We know what can happen when children are outed, when people are outed against their will. And so my decision was that I was going to stop blogging completely. We were going to go off the radar. I'd find something else to do, some other outlet, some other creative outlet for myself, and that would be that. And it was our child who said, please don't do that. Please don't do that. Because when I went into Google and I typed in like, why do I not feel like a boy when I am a boy, sort of thing. They said like there were stories of people who felt like me, and I was able to put that into words that I was transgender. But then when I said like, will my family still love me? Almost every story was horrible. Almost every story was just, I thought my parents would get it and they've kicked me out of the house, or I thought my parents would get it and they won't let me transition, or, I don't speak to my family anymore. I had to move across the country, and they really wanted some positivity there. So they said like, you have the perfect way to do that. And I think we should do that, because I felt so alone, and I don't want anyone else to feel alone like that. And I thought for myself as well, as a parent, there were so few resources in 2014. There were so few people to look at and go, this is how you do it. Okay, like I can see this. There were some trans people speaking about their experiences, which was very important, but there was nothing from the family perspective, or very little, the odd article here or there. And so, we decided that we would tell this story, but I figured, it's okay. We'll just, it's just going to go on my little blog. Nobody's going to notice. I'll just put it there. The locals will read it. And anyone who maybe, puts specific keywords into Google will find it maybe. And that will be that, but I'll feel like I did my job. And I even specifically, there was an awards show that night, and I specifically timed it to post it during the award show, figuring that nobody will see that I posted it. It went more viral than anything I had ever written. And the next thing you know, CBC is calling us, and magazines are trying to get in touch. And all these people want to know what it looks like to support a young trans person. So we had another talk about how public do we want to be? And we took it step by step. But ultimately, we became a very public family.
Mm-hmm. And I think that piece about checking in with your child around that first is so important, because in my mind, coming out as trans publicly really requires consent, right? There's like my experience of coming out publicly was not my choice. It was forced upon me. I was running in politics. The party that I was running with had said, you don't have to come out as trans, and I had no intention of running as a trans candidate because I didn't want that to overshadow my campaign. And then there was a miscommunication between the party and a media agency without checking in with me on either the party or the news agency's part. They ran a story, and I started getting texts from people going, I saw you on the news. And I went, what do you mean you saw me on the news? And it flipped my life upside down. I couldn't get jobs after that, and there were a lot of benefits to being outed as well, and that's part of the reason I'm an advocate now. But that choice of how I wanted to come out was completely taken away from me, and I really appreciate that you gave that choice to your child, and that it was so well received, because I think back to that time. That was kind of around when I was coming out as well. The only family dynamic that I remember seeing was Jazz Jennings, right? And the way that her family was supporting her through transition. There wasn't, like you said, very much information about that at all. So that's incredible that you were able to provide that for people. And then you went on, from what I understand, to write multiple books after that, right? Can you briefly talk about your experience of putting those books out and your reasoning behind that?
Well, with a blog, it's very much like a magazine article, right? There's only so much you can cover per blog post. And when my wife came out, it was more complex than I could put into a blog. And I felt like that nuanced discussion of both completely supporting the person who's transitioning, but also it being a bit of a strain on the marriage, because it definitely was. There was a lot of stress at the time, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear. I felt like that needed a more in-depth exploration. So in 2014, I published a book called Love Lives Here, A Story of Thriving in a Transgender Family. And it really did outline first our child coming out and what that looked like, and then my wife coming out and what that looked like. And it was largely through my experience as, at the time, a mother and a wife, right? But it also encompassed how my child was feeling at the time, how my wife was feeling at the time. And it went back and forth between my own sort of thoughts and first person view and my wife's, because I really wanted to make sure that it was done in a way that was respectful. I really thought I was just being a good ally. I really did. People would come to me and they'd be like, wow, like you really encapsulated the trans experience, and you're not even trans. I've never seen an ally do that before. And I was like, yeah, weird. I don't know why. but I had these set rules, right? Like, number one, sit down with my family. What do we talk about? What do we not talk about? Because there's a lot in the book that is not talked about. That was, because when you are telling a story, you have to figure out why you're telling that story. What is the intent behind it? And also, are you going to harm anyone in telling certain pieces of it? So there was a lot of, making sure it was done in an ethical way. I didn't dead name anybody, so nobody's old name was used. I approached past experiences before transition very respectfully, and nothing crossed into publication with my publisher until the trans people in my life I was writing about had seen it and approved it. So it was really this thing I wanted to give to the world as a blueprint. Not that we were perfect, but our community, our families, our friends, our neighbors, our co-workers, people were really wonderful. They messed up sometimes, but their heart was there. They really showed up for us. So I wanted to show that when you embrace trans people, we could thrive. That's all I wanted. So that book came out into the world. Then a little bit after that, some rumbling started to happen within the trans community. Now, again, at the time, I am not out. I know something's up with me at that point. I know that I'm not cis, but I'm not quite there yet. I have too much trauma, too much stuff to deal with. And some rumblings start within the trans community, like, who is this woman who's publishing this book? Who does she think she is, telling the stories of trans people? You have no right to do that. You're taking the mic away from trans people, and you are profiting off of trans people, and that is wrong. And criticism is absolutely welcome, and constructive criticism, absolutely welcome. I think it's really important to listen to all communities, especially communities that you're writing about. And of course, arguments can be made that this was my family. I had express permission and they wanted me to write this book, and the book did a lot of good. All those things are true, but still, we have the right to, people have the right to criticize. What crossed the line was that snowballed, as it often does on social media, into something that was very awful. And it became this massive pylon that lasted several days during the early stages of the pandemic. And right when my mental health was in terrible shape for other reasons as well. And I nearly took my life from that experience. It was that experience that triggered some really old trauma that I had not dealt with. I was, as a direct result of all of that, I was diagnosed with a complex form of PTSD in the hospital and started treatment for that. That became my second book. It became, because from all of that, which seemed like the absolute worst time of my life, I had never felt lower. I thought everything was over. I thought everybody hated me. My career was ruined, and that I wasn't going to live very long. From all of that came this healing and this reckoning and this growth. And that is how I was able to figure out that I am me, that I am actually trans. And I've never been in better shape because of it. So all of that led to this beautiful thing.
Amazing. Well, sometimes we have to go through those really dark periods to find who we really are, and I'm glad that you came out on the other side and you're doing well now. And now that we've set a bit of a stage of sort of who you are and how you got to this point in your life, I want to transition into what our topic for today is, which is politics in Canada and the trans experience in Canada. And there have been quite a few changes over the last number of years. Personally, I think that we were seeing sort of an uptick and things were getting better between when I started coming out in 2013 and around 2019, and then the pandemic hit, and it felt like there was some shift, a lot of sort of negative discourse that started popping up. And we've in recent years seen provinces like Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Alberta move to restrict trans rights, despite gender identity and gender expression being protected by the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code of Canada. So I'm curious to know what you've noticed personally in terms of political shifts where you live in Ontario or in Canada more generally.
My wife and I moved to Toronto about a year and a half ago with one of our kids. The other three are grown and flown, as they say, doing their own thing now. And we moved into a polyamorous situation. So we are living with another couple, and we just call ourselves like sort of a big blob of love, and it's a really wonderful experience, unexpected, wonderful experience. And I thought, great, this is Toronto. I mean, if there's anywhere that's going to be this really open, I mean, outside of, Vancouver, I would say definitely Toronto is the place you want to be if you are looking to just be yourself and not have anyone really care about it and just respect you. That has still largely been true. I have noticed that this is a really wonderful place to live, for sure. And also, we have had our own protests. So there were some nationwide protests in the fall, as some people may remember, fall of 2023. There were a lot of people out, denouncing the idea of sex education in schools and gender identity in schools. And I thought, well, it's Toronto. It can't be that bad, right? It was pretty bad. We definitely, I mean, we outnumbered. We were at Queen's Park, where the seat of our provincial government is, and we definitely outnumbered the protesters by far, which was not the case all over Ontario. It was more evenly spread or even outnumbered the other way in some other places. But Toronto showed up, and the union showed up, and people really did. But the things people were yelling right in my face were things that I thought we had moved on from. People just calling me all kinds of things, of course, groomer, pedophile, et cetera, and that is so commonplace now. Those words are they're used completely out of context now. It was the beginning of what I am seeing as a shift in Ontario that I'm really worried about. The NDP here tried to bring in a bill that would not change transgender healthcare in the province, but would form a committee of trans people and medical experts who would sit down and look at what the province is providing right now, and then, make recommendations. That was all the bill was for. It was struck down by the Conservatives, the majority government here. And I was in the House when they were, debating the bill. And I don't think I remember a single time that the Conservatives said the word trans or transgender. Not at all. Not at all, even though that is directly what we were talking about. So I do worry what that looks like. I hope that Ontario has enough heart that they would fight back. But even in Ottawa, my hometown, when my last book was published last September, I had security at my event. I had security here in Toronto too. In 2019, I didn't feel the need for security. I did not. But in 2023, 2024, oh yeah, absolutely. And when I do an event now, I have someone walk me to my car. I don't usually go alone to things anymore. It is a very different world.
And we recently had in our legislature in BC, the BC Conservatives introduced legislation to try to ban trans people from competing in sports. So this isn't unique to Ontario. Unfortunately, these types of things are happening across Canada. And one of the weird things that I've noticed recently is transphobes claiming that trans people didn't exist before 2015. And obviously, we know this isn't true, right? You had a trans child before 2015. I came out before 2015. But it speaks to this fact that our existence is at least being openly discussed more, to the point where people that didn't know about trans people now know about us. And unfortunately, that means both negative and positive things. And I'm curious to know what you've noticed in terms of sort of societal shifts in how trans people are viewed.
I think you're right that a lot of people seem to think we popped up out of nowhere and we are some kind of liberal creation, if you will, a creation of the woke.
Right.
And it's funny because if you look at who is speaking out on trans issues, yes, of course, there are a lot of very liberal, very open-minded, left-leaning trans people. There are also a few very right, and center trans people. And the right-wing ones, I think, serve to prove that you don't get to pick whether or not you're trans. You don't, I mean, a lot of these people are people who grew up with a lot of privilege in very conservative households, who are only transitioning because honestly they have no choice. I mean, this is who they are, and so I like to use them as examples that way. But I also think what's really nice is, more than ever, when I give a talk, I tend to have a lot of parents of trans kids, family members of trans kids, spouses, partners, who show up to my events. And I'm meeting a lot of people, though, just out in the wild, who, if it comes up or if they recognize me from somewhere, or if I happen to mention that I'm trans, I'm very new in transition still. So I'm 6 months in to medical transition. So sometimes people don't read me as male yet. And so, you sort of get into these little conversations with people. And it is incredible to me. I will meet grandmas who are, probably 85, and they'll be like, "Oh, my grandson is trans. He was, my granddaughter until he was 7 years old, and then now he's, grandson, and I'm so proud of him. And my nephew is non-binary, or my nibbling is non-binary." And it's just, I'm meeting so many people who are just like, "Oh yeah, I have a trans person in my family," and I think it's actually very common, more common than a lot of people realize, to have a trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming person in your family. It's just that now they have the language, they're seeing it, so they're able to do that. The other nice thing is, as much as I will speak the ills of social media, because there are plenty of ills, so it brings out the worst in people, it also provides this amazing platform, sort of the great equalizer, where people can go on there. You have kids in small towns with a TikTok account who will go on, and they're exposed to a whole bunch of people who are not like them, and so they get to see, hey, I'm not like all the other people that I know in my small circle, in my small town, in my small school, but there are all sorts of people that feel the way I feel outside of here, so I'm not alone. So they're finding the language, the connections, all the things that they need to be able to make it through and find themselves. So yeah, I think things are changing, but what happens is, we get this big, and this happens if you look throughout history, this happens every single time there's any kind of progress. You get this swing of progress, and then the pendulum goes back because people are like, no, change is scary, change is bad. I'm going to get erased because all of you are going to come and take over society and I won't have a place anymore. And then people like swing back the other way. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing like that really dark time right now. And it's going to come back again. We just got to hold on for the light.
Yeah, and that's a really good point to make. And we've talked about this, I believe, a few other times on the podcast, that things often get worse before they get better. And a lot of times it comes down to the fact that there's just more people talking about it. It's not necessarily that a larger percentage of the population hates us. It's just a larger percent of the population knows about us. And so therefore the amount of people that support us is larger, but the amount of people that don't support us is also larger. And I think what we have to do is focus on that. In politics, we call it the movable middle, right? Those people that don't understand the issue, and we need to be able to educate them and show them that, you want to be on our side, not on the side of hate, right? And I want to pivot into a conversation about sort of people's misconceptions around trans people. And there are some issues that are commonly brought up for the people that, take issue with trans people's existence. And those tend to be things like women in sports or trans women in sports, right? Or trans people using public washrooms. And we'll get to those a little bit later, but I want to focus primarily on healthcare for kids. I think this is something that you've had to deal with. But can you talk about some of the misconceptions that exist around particularly trans kids who are accessing healthcare?
Absolutely. There are so many things that people get wrong. First of all, there's this idea that children are groomed into being trans, which could not be further from the truth. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because I think that should go without saying. Nobody is sitting here going, I think I'm going to make some kids trans today. I mean, first of all, impossible. Secondly, if you have seen the wait times and the things that people need to go through to access healthcare, believe me, the last thing you want is to get a whole bunch more people on board to access that healthcare and clog up the system. I mean, there's so many things about that don't make any sense, but I digress. There's this idea that young trans kids are getting hormones and surgery, and that is not true at all. The earliest medical intervention is usually a little bit after the onset of natal puberty. And by natal puberty, I mean the puberty that a child would go through based on the gender they were assigned at birth. So in my case, for example, that would be an estrogen-driven puberty, or as a lot of people would call it, girl puberty, right? And so a trans kid, they will often wait till they're a little bit into that puberty before they even consider blockers. There's a lot of reasons for that, again, that I'm not a medical expert, I won't get into. But all that does is it hits the pause button for them. And that can be stopped at any time. The pause button lasts a good while, usually. It's not like, okay, we're going to block your puberty and start you right on some other hormones. That's not usually how it works. My own child, for example, had to wait 2.5 years on blockers before they could access estrogen, right? So there was a lot of gatekeeping. Like the amount of gatekeeping that young trans people and just adult trans people have to go through to prove that they need this healthcare is far more than anything else. And I mean anything else that they would need to access medically. That's because, generally speaking, the people who are administering it are not trans themselves and need to check off all of these boxes, right? Like, are you sure? They talk about regret. They talk about how are you feeling now versus how were you feeling a few months ago versus how are you going to feel a year from now? I mean, there's psych evaluations. There's all these different things that they have to go through in order to get that treatment. When children are very young, like when they're 5 years old, 6 years old, and they're saying, mommy, I don't feel like a girl, or I don't feel like a boy, or what is done at that point is sort of following the child, right? If the child is clearly demonstrating that this is not who they are, there would be a social transition that would take place. So that social transition could just be, my little boy is now wearing dresses, but still likes being he and him and doesn't want to grow his hair long. And it could be, no, we have a new name, we have pronouns, but all these things happen over time. It's a over time. And by the time you get to the point where that little child is now a teenager and is looking at medically transitioning, well, you have years there, years of follow-up in specialized clinics, years of talking to this child and knowing who they are, and the child figuring themselves out and the parents figuring out the child. And I mean, it's not at all what people think it is. And you'll hear the occasional scare story, right? Where I think in Quebec recently, there was somebody who claimed to be quite young, like under the age of 16, who went in to see a doctor, apparently walked out essentially with a hormone prescription. That is extremely unlikely. I'm not saying that it didn't happen in that case, but that is just not the norm. As somebody who has worked with thousands of families, that's not what usually happens. So and then there's the idea of you'll hear these stories of these people who are like, I was 16 years old and I went on blockers and I went on hormones and then I realized I wasn't trans and now I'm stuck with some of these features like a deeper voice, or, I had top surgery and I don't have breasts anymore, or whatever. But you'll notice it's almost always the exact same handful of people who are giving these interviews. It does happen. Yes, everybody knows it happens, but it is below 1%, that regret rate. It is so small compared to a lot of other things. So all this to say that these children know themselves better than anyone else, and they're not going to go through all of this, and their parents are not going to go through all of this with them if this is not what the child needs. So I really wish that people would get to know trans children, get to know these families without throwing their 2 cents in, without throwing in opinions that are based on an article they read that their uncle shared on Facebook.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I know the importance of gender diverse children having access to healthcare. You know this. But for our audience, why is it important, particularly from probably a psychological standpoint, for gender diverse children to be able to access healthcare in Canada?
I've had the interesting experience of both being a trans person who did not access that healthcare, could not access that healthcare as a child because it was not available to me as a child, and also has a partner who could not do that, but has a child who was able to do it from shortly once they started puberty, right? By the time we got them into medical professionals, our child was about what they would consider halfway through puberty. So they stopped the puberty and they were able to bring the puberty back a couple years later in the direction that best suited our child. And now our child is 10 years older than when they came out, extremely happy, successful, just happens to be trans. It is not some tragic story. It's just been a part of who they are, and they're and they're very proud of it, but it's not their main focus. And that's a wonderful gift to give somebody. Meanwhile, my wife and I have had to, she's had multiple surgeries to correct what puberty did to her, right? Puberty causes some irreversible changes. This idea that if you don't allow children to access blockers, that you are stopping them from having these irreversible changes done, from making a mistake, quote unquote, is simply untrue, because the puberty that they don't want, that's what's happening. That puberty is now ramping through, going through their body, and it is creating facial changes. So in the case of, say, a trans girl who's going through a natal testosterone puberty, she's having the same things happen to her that are happening to me right now. Deeper voice, Adam's apple, facial hair, structural changes in the body, growing taller. I mean, all these different things are happening that she can't just simply undo, or can't undo very easily later. So by denying her that, that blocker, you're forcing her through a puberty that is psychologically traumatizing for almost all trans people who go through it. The day my period stopped and I realized it wasn't coming back, I was 47 years old and I cried tears of joy, because every time from the moment that I really figured out that I needed this to stop, that my period would show up, it caused me so much pain. We call that dysphoria. And that dysphoria is this deep, deep feeling of pain, of anguish, of just having to deal with knowing that how you see yourself or what's happening in your body or how the world is seeing you is not who you really are or should not be happening. So we're doing that to children, and it raises the suicide rate 8 to 10 times higher when we don't allow that. When children are allowed access to medical care, when they are allowed to transition, their suicide rate drops just about to the average for children their age, for teenagers their age. So it absolutely, unequivocally saves lives.
Mm-hmm. And I think the unfortunate thing is that a lot of these conservative people, the socially conservative people who go, being trans, we don't want that. We want to keep, kids from being able to access healthcare if they're gender diverse. This isn't going to motivate them to go, okay, now I agree with you. But I also like to approach it from the financial angle, right? Because a lot of them are also fiscally conservative. And I like to point out, do you know how much people are going to have to now try to reverse? And that's being paid for with your tax dollars. If you don't want to spend a whole bunch of money putting trans people through all of these different procedures, allow them to have access to healthcare earlier on, and that won't be an expense that you have to incur. And it's sort of a weird way to look at it, because it's a little bit dehumanizing for trans people. But any angle that I think we can approach this from to get people on our side is beneficial in some ways. And I think another big piece of this is education, right? Like, I didn't know that I was trans until I was 23, not because I didn't know how I was feeling, but because I didn't have the words to describe how I was feeling. And if I'd had those words, maybe I could have started on blockers when I was a kid. Maybe I wouldn't have had to go through all of those procedures. So it's that hand-in-hand component of making sure people understand what it means to be trans, and then understand that it's necessary that people have access to healthcare, and that trans inclusive healthcare or gender diverse inclusive healthcare does save lives, like you point out. And that's something that I would hope everyone's going to support, right? Like every life is valuable.
Well, sure. And I mean, the other piece, if we want to talk money, one of the things I did for my second book one Sunday afternoon is I went through the stats on trauma and treating trauma. And in the US, one of the things that they have shown to be, if they could solve this one problem, it would save the taxpayer more money than anything. It's childhood trauma. Mm-hmm. If they could stop childhood trauma from occurring somehow, and of course that would be a very big ask. We're talking like, housing issues, addictions, et cetera, right? There's all these different things that would have to come in. But if we could stop childhood trauma, then the people would not grow up traumatized, and they would not need as much in, help from the system later. And I think that speaks to the psychological damage that a lot of trans people go through as well. Like, a lot of my trauma, and some of it has, some of my therapy has been paid for by the taxpayer. Certainly not a lot of it, because it's very hard to access mental health care. But I have had definitely my sessions, and a lot of it has been as a direct result of having to be a closeted queer person. If we could eliminate that, so many young people would grow up a lot happier. We're already seeing that happening in younger generations. Why take that away from them? They're doing so much better than we were doing.
Mm-hmm. And getting into one of these other issues that people bring up is trans people in sports. So I'm curious to know what your take on that is. Generally, the concerns that are brought up are around, fairness and safety. And as someone who plays recreational sports, I get criticized for playing women's sports all the time. And I go, none of us are here to be competitive. We're just here to have fun. Like, why are you so concerned about someone having like a minute advantage over someone else at the recreational level? But even at a professional level, there's really no evidence to suggest that there is inequity or unfairness or safety issues. But I'm curious just to know your thoughts on that.
Look, I mean, in a lot of sports, they have weight and, you know, and height and all different types of categories, right? I don't see how this falls outside of it in any way whatsoever. I will tell you, I have been working now, so I can only really speak about this anecdotally. I've looked at the evidence. I'm definitely not somebody who can weigh in as an expert on trans sports, but the evidence is very clear that there are really no advantages. But what I like to say to people is, would you like me now, or a year from now, or 2 years from now, on testosterone? Would you like me to compete in women's sports? Is that where you think that I belong? Because let me tell you, I have more than doubled my weights in the last 6 than I have in the last 10 years as a strength trainer. So I've been doing strength training forever. I am stronger. I am faster. I mean, and that is because of the testosterone in my body right now. If you were to take that away from me and the estrogen was to ramp back up, I would lose this muscle mass that I've gained. I would lose, some of my oxygen. I would lose a lot of the things all the advantages that I have right now. It's not about the puberty that I went through. It's about the hormones that I'm on right now. And that's what people don't get. There's a, I forget his name right now. You may remember his name, but there's a trans guy who is a wrestler. I believe he's in Texas.
Matt Ryan or something
like that. Yeah. And they've been forcing him. They were forcing him to play with the girls, right? They were forcing him to wrestle with the girls, and he kept winning over and over, right? Because he can't help it. He's just a lot stronger. Right. And so I think that people have this, they focus very, very heavily on trans women. And trans women are very unfairly attacked for so many reasons. A lot of it is misogyny. I mean, we know that, but trans women are very, very heavily attacked. And so all the focus is on what trans women are doing, what bathrooms, you're using, what sports you're playing, that sort of thing. But we forget, and a lot of people forget, trans men exist. And I am already getting to the point where if I haven't used a women's washroom in a while, but if I were to use a women's washroom, I would have a few people looking at me funny, right? And soon I'm going to get to the point where I walk into a washroom and someone would kick me out because I very clearly am not going to look feminine at all. And I think, when we talk about this stuff, we need to remember that it's not just about trans women. And I want to steer the conversation more towards trans men sometimes, just so people can see, oh yeah, my argument falls apart the minute I factor in trans men, right?
Mm-hmm. And that's something I always struggle with, because I don't want to speak for trans men, but I also want to point out, you're not thinking this through completely. You're focusing on trans women, and you don't realize how this is going to impact sports. For instance, if you say trans men have to compete against women, that's essentially like doping, right? You're on this performance enhancing medication, and why would that be considered fair? Right? And that's not creating fairness at all. That's not creating safety advantages in any way. And I think the same thing applies to bathrooms, right? That's trans women in women's bathrooms is focused on so much. And people don't consider that if you're forcing people to use a bathroom according to the gender they were assigned at birth, you're also saying trans men are supposed to be using women's bathrooms. Is that really something that you want? And I'm curious to know your thoughts about trans people in gendered spaces like washrooms and change rooms as well.
I'm really sick of, first of all, this whole washroom talk, which we know has actually been proven to have been linked to some very conservative Christian groups who just wanted to stir the pot, and we're like, how do we get people to not like trans people? I know. Let's create a boogeyman. Let's talk about these predators in washrooms, right? And it is so frustrating because up until then, trans people were just going into the washrooms that they were going into, and from what I've heard from a lot of older trans people, including a lot of older trans women who've been out for a while, nobody cared. It wasn't a big deal until everybody started to make it a big deal. I think gendered spaces are a little dated at this point. I mean, we also, speaking about binary trans people, we also have to speak about non-binary trans people. In my particular case, before I realized I was a trans guy and I needed to transition in this direction, I identified as non-binary for a couple of years. And non-binary, I need to say, because I say it that way, I think sometimes people go, oh, you think it's just a pit stop on your way to, identifying as a binary trans person. That is not the case at all. My child is non-binary. I absolutely know that this is a very valid identity. And with that knowledge comes the fact that my child feels uncomfortable in any washroom that is gendered. I mean, it doesn't make sense. So I had the privilege of helping to design an art spaces non-gendered public washroom. And it kind of weirded people out when it first opened a few years ago. And then everybody was totally cool with it. They're like, oh, this isn't just for trans people. Isn't this wonderful? So my brother has Down syndrome, and he's in his 30s. And for a long time, my mom was very uncomfortable just letting him go into the men's washroom without somebody there. And in these spaces, she doesn't have to worry about that. And they're not scary spaces. You go in, they're often just these single stall, floor to ceiling stalls with doors that go right down to the floor.
Even more privacy.
Right, exactly. There's even more privacy. And oh, gasp, heavens, you wash your hands next to people who might not look just like you. That's it. That's the whole thing. There's not even usually a door, right, into the actual washroom. And there's so many of these spaces in Toronto. All of the new restaurants and buildings are just creating these gender neutral, or as we like to call them, gendy neuch spaces. And and it's wonderful. And just nobody blinks anymore. I find I'm more comfortable. And I think a lot of people are more comfortable. So I'm really getting to the point where I'm saying, like, yes, I know that, some people find it very affirming to be able to go into specific washrooms. I just want to go in, do my business, wash my hands, and get out. I think that's a lot of people. So let's start moving on from that. They've been doing that in Europe, for many places in Europe, for a while now without any issue. So why are we clinging to this? I don't get it.
Yeah, and I mean, I come from a construction background, and gender-neutral washrooms generally reduce the amount of plumbing that you have to put in, so it's cheaper for building costs, less wasteful. There's all sorts of benefits to it. And the other thing I want to touch on, too, is that boogeyman piece, right? Because I think that the image people are creating in their minds is of some predator man dressing up as a woman to enter women's spaces and take advantage of women. And when you break that down, it doesn't make a lot of sense, because if you're saying, well, trans men have to use women's spaces, that actually makes it way easier, because if in your mind people are needing to adhere to these, rules around entering spaces, well, that just makes it a lot easier for someone to say, oh, I'm just a trans man. They don't even have to put on the dress anymore. Not that it was ever happening in the first place, but
no.
If you follow that line of logic, it just completely falls apart.
Yeah, and it makes no sense.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm wondering, are there any other sort of pressing issues that are facing gender diverse people that you think would be really important to highlight?
I think there's a lot of them, but I think right now a lot of people are really scared. A lot of people in our community are feeling like the walls are closing in, that it's just a matter of time. I mean, we're seeing a lot of that in the US and the UK right now, and in other places in the world, absolutely. And in Canada, we're seeing more and more politicians using us as a wedge issue. What I want to say is I've been doing this for a long time, and I would like to think I'm fairly successful in reaching people. And I'm just going to give away my big secret that is not a secret at all, because this is what I want people to do. I want people, if you're going to be public, and no, you don't have to be public, and no, you don't have to be visible. It's not safe for everybody, and it's not for everybody. So I'm not saying that. But if that is something that you want to do, focus on connection. Focus on relatability. And I'm not saying you want to be just like everybody else. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that humans, when you look at, through history, differences are often what people have focused on when they've gone to war, or when they've gone, when they've had these big clashes, when there's been a lot of discrimination. People focus on the differences. Show them that we're not that different. So what I do, I talk about how I have kids. Now, not everybody has kids, but I have kids. I think there's this idea, for example, that trans people don't have any children, which is ridiculous. Lots of trans people have children, and lots of trans people who transition very young are growing up and having children in one way or another, right? And some aren't, and that's fine too. But a lot of people have families, so I like to talk about having family. I have a dog. I like to talk about how much I love my dog. I paint, so I like to talk about that too. And how much I love fashion, because I really do. I love to wear fun shirts, and I love to do my hair up, and I enjoy that kind of thing. And I just like to bring a lot of joy to the table. Not false joy, not pretend joy, but when I am feeling joyous, I like to share it, because when I can do that, I think that it reminds people that we are just all human. I just happen to be trans, and maybe you happen to not be trans, but that's okay, because we find that commonality, right? So the more that I do that, and the more that I engage with people, the more that I have found that they will come back to me and say, I was at this family gathering, and, one of my family members said this really transphobic thing, and I remembered you. And I was like, that's not what trans people are like, because I follow Rowan on social media, or I've read Rowan's books, and I know that he's not like that. Mm-hmm. So I spoke up, and I said something, and I corrected it, right? So I think the more that we do that, the more that we change opinions, the more that we change votes, the more that we make it safer for all of us. There is a time to get angry, and there is a time to rise up and fight, and I will be the first person to do it if I need to do it. But I will also lead with love, which is what's tattooed on my arm. And I encourage everybody to do that too.
Mm-hmm. And I think even if you're the type of person who goes, well, I don't want to necessarily talk about all the good things. I want to stick it to the man, or I want to stick it to the oppressor, right? You can still do that by talking about your joy, because honestly, it pisses off the people who hate you. And sometimes that can be validating in and of itself. I mean, the other day I just posted about making ravioli, because that was something that brought me joy. And it started this whole debate about trans people in sports. And I went, anyone who comes across this is going to see how ridiculous that is. I'm talking about ravioli, and you're making it about trans people in sports. And so you can achieve your goal of bringing positivity in the world, showing that you're not that different from other people, and still sticking it to the oppressor at the same time, right?
You are so right.
And I guess that leads well into my next question, which is, what is your hope for the future?
I hope to be out of a job. I really do. I hope to be out of a job. I hope one day that I get to sit with my grandkids. I have, big old grandpa, and I'm like, kids, can you believe that once upon a time, people had an issue with what bathroom your grandpa used? And they're like, what? Grandpa, what do you mean? They go, people had an issue with transgender people. And I'm like, what? That's ridiculous. That's what I want. That is my hope. My hope is that this becomes one of those like old stuffy history books. I think about, and unfortunately we're seeing some of this come up again today, because, racism has never gone away. But I remember watching these, or seeing in the history books, because I'm too young to have witnessed it, when segregation laws were struck down for schools in the U.S. and Black children started going to school with white children. and the mothers, the angry, outraged white moms protesting outside the school as these little Black children were just going into school to learn, heaven forbid, right? And at the time, they really thought that they were just, they were just fighting for what's right, because this was just going to destroy society, and this was wrong. And you look at their pictures now and the things that they had up on their signs, and it looks ridiculous. It's so clearly wrong. They're so clearly on the wrong side of history. That is going to happen again. It's going to happen with us. We're going to, the people who are standing and protesting our right to exist, our right to fit into society, our right to just be ourselves. We're going to see their pictures and their angry comments and their angry placards. We're going to see that one day in pictures, and and kids in 2-3 generations are going to look at that and go, wow, were they ever foolish? That's my hope.
Yeah, and I think that's, like you said, it's become a reality when it comes to certain groups of people, and it will become a reality when it comes to gender diverse people as well. I've even seen a TikTok trend lately where parents have conversations with their kids about what it means to be gay, and the fact that people used to have a problem, well, still have a problem with people being gay, but within those kids' circles, there is no issue there, and they can't believe that anyone else would have an issue with that. And that's, I agree with you, that's a world that I want to see in the future, where those differences are not an issue, and we don't have wars over differences because it's a non-issue. And I'm curious to know how you think our audience can help to achieve that future. You've talked about spreading positivity if you're a gender diverse person, but in general, our audience is made up of gender diverse people as well as, cisgender people. How can they help to achieve that future?
I think keep centering the voices of gender diverse people, absolutely, and learn from us and take those learnings with you, because you will be exposed probably to conversations. You'll be privy to conversations and comments and feelings that no one would dare say around us, right? I know this happens because I used to be one of the people that was privy to those conversations, and it was up to me in those moments to go, I'm sorry, but this isn't right. Your facts aren't correct. And it can be really hard to do that, but it is really important to do that. Call out misinformation. Make sure that people know that little kids aren't getting surgery, and that, the regret rate is not, 60% or whatever new number people are trying to throw out today. Check in on your trans friends. Check in on them and see how they're doing right now, because things are a little scary. And to the gender diverse community, as someone who's been on the other side of this, right now we really need our allies. It's really important that we have our allies. So, bring people closer, bring people in, let them know what you need, let them know what the community needs. Don't assume that they know everything, because they might not. You might be really, really invested in this bill that's, that some politician is pushing, and wondering why your cis friends aren't standing up for it. But they honestly just might not be in the same news circles. They might not know. Let them know, and then let them know how they can help. So I think that the more that we all communicate with open hearts and open minds, the more we all work together, the more we're going to see in terms of change and getting this hate out the door as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. And is there anything else that you'd like to share with the audience before we wrap things up?
I just want to say, if you have gotten through all of this, thank you. You're wonderful. If you are struggling right now, I know what that feels like, and I want you to know that you are loved. You are loved, and you are thought of, and that things can feel really dark right now. Get the supports that you need. You deserve that, and know that we're going to rise. We really are. We're going to see a much brighter future.
Wonderful. Well said, and thank you very much for joining me today. This has been a social justice podcast. I'm your host, NICOLA SPURLING. I've been joined today by Rowan Jetté Knox for a conversation about trans issues, Canadian politics, all sorts of different things, and I've loved every minute of it. Thank you again. You've been listening to a social justice podcast hosted by NICOLA SPURLING, brought to you by The Flag Shop, and inspired by a social justice coloring book.